April 29th, 1945, Hacksaw Ridge, Okinawa. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came down in thin, icy needles that carried the smell of mud, smoke, and the iron tang of blood. Beneath a sky the color of gunmetal, the cliffs of Maeda Escarpment rose straight from the earth, steep, jagged, and black as sin. The men of the 77th Infantry Division called it Hacksaw Ridge, because climbing it felt like being fed into the teeth of a giant saw. Private Andrew Coleman stood at its base, his uniform plastered to his skin, a battered medic's satchel hanging from his shoulder, and in his hands, no weapon, no rifle, just a single coil of thick hemp rope. He could hear the ridge breathing above him, that eerie mix of mortar shells, ricochets, and human cries that made the night itself seem alive. Behind him, the few survivors of his platoon crouched in silence, too exhausted to curse, too afraid to move. They had been ordered to retreat. Coleman had been ordered to retreat. But he hadn't moved. He couldn't. Somewhere up there, beyond the smoke, beyond the barbed wire, beyond the dying, were 75 wounded men. His brothers. His duty. He touched the rope, feeling its rough fibers scrape his palms. That rope was all he had. That and a prayer. A shell exploded not far away, showering the cliff base with shards of stone. Coleman flinched but didn't run. He looked up at the ridge again. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "Lord, give me strength to get one more." And then, without a word to anyone, he began to climb. The rope dug into the rock face, slipping in the rain. His boots found cracks where none existed. His fingers bled against the limestone. The ascent was slow, brutal, and silent. Every few feet he froze, waiting for searchlights to pass, listening for the rattle of machine guns. Above him, the enemy waited. Below, his unit watched a shadow rise into the storm. By the time he reached the top, the world had become smoke and thunder. The battlefield stretched before him like the surface of the moon, craters, twisted steel bodies. He dropped flat as tracer fire slashed overhead. The smell of sulfur was everywhere. The Japanese defenders had turned the plateau into a labyrinth of bunkers and tunnels. No one should have been alive up here. And yet, somewhere in that hell, voices cried out for help. Coleman crawled forward, clutching his satchel, whispering names he couldn't hear back. When he found the first wounded man, a private with shrapnel in his thigh, he dragged him to the cliff's edge, tied the rope around his waist, and prayed the knots would hold. As he eased the man over the precipice, the rope hissed against the wet rock, glowing faintly from the friction. Coleman watched until the figure vanished into the fog below. Then he turned back and went for another. Hour after hour, the pattern repeated, find, bind, drag, lower. Each time he returned to the edge, the ridge looked steeper, the night darker. He stopped counting the men. He stopped feeling his hands. All that remained was movement, prayer, and the creak of the rope. Then came the explosion. A mortar shell landed close enough to lift him from the ground. He hit the dirt hard. When he opened his eyes, the rope beside him was burning. The fire ran up the line like a living thing, eating the fibers one by one. Coleman grabbed it, smothering the flames with his hands, his palms searing. When the smoke cleared, the rope was severed, split into two uneven halves. That should have ended everything. But it didn't. He tore strips from his uniform, twisted them with the shorter half of the rope, and knotted the ends into a makeshift splice. It was crude, ugly, and half-melted. Yet when he tugged, it held. The impossible had happened. The burned rope was now stronger than before. He didn't question it. He simply kept going. By dawn, he had lowered more than a dozen men. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, but his mind refused to stop. Every time he thought the ridge was empty, another cry cut through the wind. Each time he found someone breathing, he whispered the same words. Hold on. You're going home. Down below, the soldiers who had abandoned the ridge began to realize what was happening. Shapes were descending through the mist, one after another, swinging gently on the rope. Some thought it was ghosts. Others thought the medic had lost his mind. But when they saw the first survivor hit the ground alive, they fell silent. Back on the ridge, Coleman found himself surrounded by smoke and silence. His canteen was empty, his gloves shredded. Somewhere nearby, a wounded soldier groaned in the shadows. He crawled toward the sound and froze. The uniform wasn't American. It was Japanese. The man's chest was crushed beneath a beam of splintered wood. His helmet lay beside him, riddled with holes. Coleman could have left him there. Should have. Instead, he took a knee, poured the last of his water onto the soldier's lips, and whispered something neither of them could understand. He didn't know that this act would change the night's fate again. Before we climb any higher together, take a moment. If stories like this remind you that courage isn't about the gun in your hand, but the heart that drives it, hit that subscribe button right now, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from around the world. I read every single one. You're part of WW2 Frontline Legends. Now, let's go back to the ridge, where one medic, alone in the dark, was about to defy both armies. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It came down in cold, needle-thin streaks that carved rivers through the red clay and washed the blood into the sea. The smell of cordite and rotting jungle mixed with the salt air, coating every breath like rust. High above the shattered trees rose the black wall of the Mayada Escarpment, a cliff so sheer it seemed to slice the clouds in half. The men of the 77th Infantry Division called it Hacksaw Ridge because it chewed up everything that touched it. Private Andrew Coleman stood at its base, soaked to the bone, helmet dented, eyes hollow from 2 days without sleep. In his hands, a coil of hemp rope heavy with rain. No rifle, no bayonet, just that rope and a medic's satchel patched with blood and mud. Behind him, the remnants of his platoon huddled in a crater, whispering prayers that sounded more like apologies. They had been ordered to retreat. Coleman had been ordered to retreat. But he couldn't. Not while the cries still echoed from the ridge above, 75 voices calling for help, fading one by one. He tightened his grip on the rope. The fibers bit into his palms, grounding him. "Lord, give me strength to get one more," he murmured, barely louder than the rain. Then he stepped toward the cliff. A thunderous crack split the night as a shell landed nearby, shaking the ground under his boots. Pebbles rained down like hail. He didn't flinch. He pressed the rope against the wet stone, tied his first knot, and began to climb. Each foot of ascent was a battle. The limestone tore his fingernails, the rope burned his wrists. Twice he slipped, dangling above the abyss, boots kicking for purchase. Machine gun tracers stitched the sky above him like orange lightning. He kept climbing. When he reached the top, dawn hadn't yet come, but the ridge was alive, a hellscape of flame, smoke, and steel. Japanese mortars barked from hidden tunnels. Shouts in 2 languages mingled with the scream of the wounded. Coleman dropped flat and crawled through the mud, heart hammering. He found his first survivor less than 20 yards in, a corporal, leg shredded by shrapnel. Coleman pressed a morphine syringe into his arm, tore a strip of his own shirt for a bandage, and whispered, "You're going home." He dragged the man to the cliff edge, tied the rope around his waist, and let him down into the fog. The rope hissed and swayed, sparks flickered from friction. When the line went slack, Coleman exhaled once, then turned back for another. The next hours blurred into a rhythm of agony, crawl, patch, drag lower. He stopped counting after 20 men. The ridge seemed endless. Every crater hid another broken body. He ignored the bullets that snapped overhead. His only fear was running out of rope. Then fate struck. A mortar exploded 10 feet away, throwing him against a boulder. When he came to, his ears rang, and the world was orange with fire. His rope smoldered on the ground, half severed, the heat eating it alive. He slapped the flames out with his bare hands until the smell of burnt flesh filled his nostrils. When it was over, the rope was ruined, split into 2 uneven halves. He sat in the mud, trembling, staring at the useless ends. For the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe the others were right. Maybe this was suicide. Then a voice whispered in his head, the same one that had carried him up the cliff. "Tie the ends together." He tore fabric from his uniform, braided it with the hemp, and knotted until his fingers bled. When he pulled, the line held. Harder still, it refused to break. Somehow the fire had tempered it. A burned, ugly miracle. He slung the rope over his shoulder and went back to work. By midnight, the ridge was carpeted with shell casings and bodies. Coleman moved through it like a ghost, face black with soot, breath shallow. Each trip to the edge felt longer, each body heavier. Sometimes he spoke to them even when they couldn't hear, telling stories, promising they'd wake up in the morning. The act kept him sane. Below, his comrades began to notice. At first they thought the shapes descending through the fog were corpses. Then one groaned. Then another raised a hand. The whispers spread through the camp like wildfire. Someone's bringing them down. The men stared into the mist, waiting for the next silhouette. Some said they could hear a voice above the wind, soft, steady, praying between every pull of the rope. On the ridge, Coleman's world had narrowed to inches. He crawled toward a faint sound, a cough maybe. When he reached it, he froze. The helmet wasn't American. A Japanese soldier lay trapped beneath a collapsed beam, chest crushed, eyes glassy but aware. Blood bubbled at his lips. Coleman hesitated, torn between instinct and mercy. The man's hand trembled, reaching for something, not a weapon but a canteen. "Mizu," the soldier rasped. "Water." Coleman looked at the sky, then at the dying man, and sighed. He pulled his own canteen from his belt and held it to the soldier's mouth. The man drank, closed his eyes, and whispered something Coleman couldn't understand. A thank you. A prayer. Maybe both. Coleman didn't know that the act of compassion he gave to an enemy would alter what came next, and save him before sunrise. Down below, a lieutenant paced nervously. The ridge should have been silent by now, but the rope kept moving. Every few minutes another figure appeared out of the mist. Some were conscious, others barely breathing, but all alive. The soldiers at the base began to haul them in shifts, calling up into the fog. "Who's up there?" No answer came, only the whisper of the rope sliding over stone. When the last man touched the ground, someone shouted, "He's still up there." But by then, the ridge was quiet again. Up top, Coleman crouched beside the Japanese soldier, wrapping a torn blanket around him. The night wind howled, carrying distant artillery from the valley. He had one flare left, one chance to signal the medics below, but using it would expose his position to enemy snipers. He hesitated, finger on the trigger of the flare gun he'd taken from a fallen officer. He never pulled it. Because just then, the soldier he'd saved moved. Weakly, painfully, the man pointed toward a cluster of rocks. Coleman crawled over and found 2 wounded Americans he'd missed, one unconscious, one pleading for help. The Japanese soldier slumped back, eyes closing. He would not wake again. Coleman stayed with the Americans, patched what he could, and whispered again, "You're going home." By the time the sun bled over Okinawa's horizon, the ridge was a silhouette of smoke against the crimson sky. Coleman stood at the edge, gripping his scorched rope. His arms shook from exhaustion, his face streaked with soot and tears. Below, he could see figures gathering, pointing upward, cheering through the morning mist. He had no idea how many he'd saved. He only knew there were still more out there. He looked down at his hands. The rope fibers fused into his skin and smiled faintly. "Just one more," he whispered. And then he turned back into the smoke. The sun slipped behind the clouds and Hacksaw Ridge became a silhouette of fire against the black horizon. Smoke curled upward like fingers clawing at the heavens. The Japanese guns were alive again, their bursts echoing across the valley with mechanical precision. For the soldiers below, night meant safety. For Andrew Coleman, it meant duty. He crouched in a shallow crater, wrapping his hands in strips of torn fabric. The rope he'd reforged from its burned halves coiled beside him like a sleeping serpent. He tugged at it once more, solid, unyielding. In the silence between explosions, he whispered, "Hold for me, just a little longer." Then he rose. Coleman crossed the ridge alone. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. Lightning flashed far out at sea, revealing a battlefield frozen in time. Shell holes filled with water, rifles jutting from the mud like grave markers, and the glint of helmets half buried in clay. Somewhere in that desolation lay the living among the dead. He found them one by one. A sergeant with his jaw wired shut, a boy from Kentucky missing half a boot, a communications officer whose radio had melted to his back. Each man he touched seemed surprised to see him. Some thought he was a hallucination. Others called him an angel. Coleman said nothing. Words would only slow him down. He tied the rope around their chests, eased them over the edge, and prayed. Down below, the rescuers worked in silence, taking each body, laying it on stretchers, and sending the rope back up again. The pattern became mechanical, almost sacred. When the line tightened, it was faith itself pulling them home. But as the hours dragged on, the wind began to shift. The smoke cleared enough for the Japanese spotters to notice movement at the ridge. Rifle fire erupted from hidden foxholes, ripping through the fog. Bullets snapped past Coleman's ears, striking sparks from the rocks. He dropped flat, heart pounding, waiting for the firing to stop. It didn't. Then came the mortars. The first shell landed near the cliff's lip, showering him with dirt. The second exploded directly above, ripping through the air with a sound like tearing metal. The rope jerked violently. One of the wounded dangling below swung against the rock face, screaming. Coleman leapt to the edge, gripping the line with both hands. He could feel the fibers straining, splitting under the weight. Without thinking, he looped the rope around his own waist and leaned backward, anchoring it with his body. The man reached the ground alive. Coleman collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. The rope smoked where it had cut into the stone, leaving deep grooves. When he touched it, the heat stung his fingers, but the weave still held. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Not yet. Not until the last one." Hours blurred together. The rain came back, hard and cold, washing the soot from his face, but never the blood from his hands. At times he thought he heard footsteps behind him, voices calling his name, but when he turned, there was nothing. Just the echo of the dying ridge. He stopped feeling hunger, stopped feeling pain. All that existed was the next man, the next knot, the next descent. His faith turned mechanical, his movements divine habit. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that if he ever stopped to count, the fear would return, and he could never climb again. Near midnight, a flare burst overhead, painting the world in red. It revealed a nightmare tableau. Coleman standing alone on the ridge, surrounded by the bodies he couldn't move yet, rope in hand, eyes fixed on the cliffs below. From the valley, the men watching saw it too. Someone shouted, "He's still up there." The words carried like thunder. Then the machine guns opened again. Coleman threw himself behind a mound of earth. Tracer fire slashed through the air, punching holes in the bodies around him. He could feel the impact of each bullet through the ground. When the barrage finally stopped, the silence was worse. He crawled out and checked the rope. It was still intact, glowing faintly where bullets had grazed it. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping, metal against metal. He followed the sound and found a small Japanese bunker partially caved in. Inside, a young soldier lay trapped, his leg pinned by a beam. The boy couldn't have been more than 18. His hands trembled as he aimed a pistol at Coleman's chest. Coleman raised his palms slowly, eyes calm. "Easy," he whispered. The boy's hand shook, then fell. The pistol dropped into the mud. He was too weak to pull the trigger. Coleman crawled closer, lifted the beam with a groan, and freed the leg. The wound was terrible. He pressed a bandage over it, then looked around. The bunker was filled with maps, medical supplies, and astonishingly, coils of fresh rope. That was the second twist of fate. He took one coil, tied it to his own burned line, and made a new length twice as long. Stronger. Cleaner. Enough to lower two men at once. He glanced at the Japanese boy, who stared back with confusion, and something like gratitude. Coleman pointed to the cliff. The boy nodded. Together, they lifted the next wounded American. The Japanese soldier held one end of the rope, while Coleman guided the descent. For a brief, impossible moment, two enemies worked side by side, bound by a single purpose, to save life instead of take it. When the man reached the bottom, the boy smiled faintly. Coleman reached out his hand. The boy took it. Moments later, a shell obliterated the bunker. The blast threw Coleman backward, slamming him into the ground. When he crawled up, coughing, the bunker was gone. Only fire and rubble remained. He shouted, but no one answered. The rope, though, still lay across the edge, unburned, untouched, waiting. He gripped it, knuckles white, and whispered, "You didn't die for nothing." By dawn, the rope stretched like a scar down the side of the cliff. Dozens of men lay at the bottom, shivering, bleeding, alive. Coleman's hands were stripped of skin, his uniform in tatters. He no longer felt the rain, or the pain in his back, or the tremor in his knees. All he felt was the heartbeat of the ridge itself, pulsing beneath him like some vast, wounded thing. He tied another man to the line, lowered him, prayed, repeated. Each time, the prayer grew quieter until it was nothing but breath. When at last he ran out of wounded to find, he turned in a slow circle. The ridge was silent. Smoke drifted from the tunnels. Somewhere below, someone was shouting his name, but it sounded far away. He walked back to the edge and sat down, the rope coiled beside him, rain falling on his face. The horizon burned orange as the first rays of morning touched Okinawa. He leaned forward, whispering to no one, "Maybe that's enough." Then, as if remembering, he added softly, "Just one more." He pulled himself to his feet and disappeared into the mist. Below, the soldiers counted the rescued, 10, 20, 50, 70. They couldn't believe it. The officers argued, insisting it was impossible for one man. But when they searched the ridge at sunrise, they found the evidence, a trail of bandages, empty morphine tubes, and one rope still anchored to the rocks, soaked in rain and blood, its knots fused by fire. There was no sign of Coleman. Some said he was wounded and taken by the medics before anyone noticed. Others whispered he never came down at all, that the ridge itself kept him. A few swore they saw a figure climbing again at dawn, vanishing into the smoke. Whatever the truth, the rope remained, charred, twisted, indestructible. It hung there for days, fluttering in the wind like a flag. And somewhere, deep in the mud of Okinawa, a burned length of hemp waited to tell the rest of its story. Morning broke over Okinawa like a curtain of gold drawn across a battlefield of ghosts. The guns had fallen silent. Smoke drifted lazily over the escarpment, curling between shattered trees and the jagged cliffs that men had died to climb. The ground steamed with the warmth of the dead and the chill of the sea breeze. To most, the battle for Hacksaw Ridge was over. But for those who had been there that night, the war had left something behind, a question that no one could answer. At the base of the cliff, soldiers moved among the wounded. They spoke in hushed voices, afraid to disturb whatever miracle had taken place. Some of the men lay with eyes half open, whispering the same name through cracked lips. Coleman. Others said nothing, only clutched the rope burns on their chests as proof that they had truly been saved. An officer stood apart from them, binoculars raised, scanning the ridge. He saw the rope still hanging, blackened, frayed, dancing in the wind like a banner from another world. Whoever did this, he muttered, he defied death itself. The man beside him crossed himself and whispered. Maybe death stepped aside. A recovery team climbed the ridge that afternoon. They expected to find a body. Instead, they found footprints, one pair, wandering through the mud, leading from one crater to another, as if searching even after the fight was done. Near a burned bunker, they found a medic's satchel, empty except for a single morphine ampoule and a folded scrap of paper. It was barely legible under the soot, but 3 words were still visible. Just one more. The officer folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. When they returned to the base, the rope was gone. Days later, rumors spread through the camp. Some claimed a Japanese officer had cut the rope down before surrendering, saying it belonged to a man who had honored both armies. Others insisted Coleman himself had destroyed it, cutting it into 7 pieces and burying them across the ridge, one for every 10 men saved. A few said it had simply vanished during the night, taken by the wind that haunted the cliffs. Whatever the truth, no one could explain how 75 soldiers had been lowered alive from a ridge no sane man could climb even once. The medics who examined the survivors said the knots on the rope were unlike any they had ever seen, braided in a pattern that didn't match standard military training. It was as if the rope itself had been reforged for one purpose alone. Back in the States, news of the Hacksaw miracle reached the newspapers. The Army published an official commendation but could not verify the rescuer's fate. His file ended with a single line: missing in action, presumed dead. To the men who owed him their lives, that line felt wrong. He wasn't dead. He was simply gone. Months passed. The war ended. The world exhaled. Soldiers returned home and tried to rebuild lives from the pieces of memory that war had left them. But for those who had seen the ridge, sleep never came easy. Some nights they swore they heard the scrape of rope against stone, the whisper of boots climbing upward through the fog. One veteran wrote in his diary, "When the wind blows from the east, I can still smell the smoke of that rope." Maybe he's still climbing. Years later, a historian researching the Okinawa campaign visited the site. The jungle had reclaimed most of it, vines where trenches once ran, flowers where bodies had fallen. Yet when he reached the base of the cliff, he found something tangled in the roots of a tree. It was a section of hemp, fused and blackened, as if by flame. He sent it to Washington for testing. The lab results were inconclusive. The fibers were impossibly strong, stronger than any rope of its kind. No one could explain why. The legend grew. Soldiers told their sons, who told their own children, about the medic who climbed without a weapon, who fought without hate, who saved without condition. They called him many things, angel, ghost, fool, hero, but always ended the story the same way. He went back for one more. In time, the Army built a memorial at the base of the ridge. No statue, no plaque, just a stone inscribed with 7 braided grooves and a single word beneath: faith. On some nights, when the moonlight hit it right, the grooves looked like rope burns. Decades later, an old man visited the site. He wore civilian clothes and carried nothing but a Bible and a small pouch. The locals said he came every year, arriving quietly, leaving before sunrise. No one knew his name. One caretaker swore he once saw the man lay his hands on the stone and whisper. They all made it down. When asked who he was talking about, the old man just smiled and said, "The ones who were supposed to die." He never returned after that. Today, Historians still debate what really happened on that night in 1945. Some call it the greatest act of courage in the Pacific Campaign. Others dismiss it as myth. But every analysis, every military record, every diagram of the ridge leads to the same unexplainable fact. One man, unarmed, defied two armies and gravity itself to save 75 souls. And when the world came looking for proof, all they found was a burned rope and silence. If you stand at the top of Hacksaw Ridge now, you can still feel it, the wind rising off the sea, the hum of something invisible but alive. Some say it's the sound of the jungle. Others swear it's the rope moving in the air, waiting for another set of hands. War has many heroes, but few miracles. Most courage comes with a rifle in hand, a banner to charge behind. Coleman had neither. What he carried was heavier, conviction. A faith that every life mattered, even the ones called enemy. A belief that duty wasn't about killing, it was about saving. That was his weapon, his armor, his rebellion against the madness around him. They tried to honor him later, with medals, citations, and parades, but nothing seemed enough. Because his story was never about recognition. It was about what a single human being can do when the world expects nothing. A burned rope, a whispered prayer, and 75 beating hearts. And maybe that's why the legend endures. Because somewhere inside each of us is the same question that kept him climbing. Would I have gone back for one more? The truth is, none of us know. But men like Andrew Coleman remind us that courage isn't loud. It doesn't always march or shoot or shout. Sometimes it simply ties a knot in the dark, holds on, and refuses to let go. If this story moved you, take a moment. Share it with someone who still believes in courage. Hit like so more people can find these forgotten heroes. And if you haven't already, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends right now. Every week, we bring back the voices history tried to bury. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from around the world. I read every single one, and maybe your name will appear in the next story. Because legends like this one don't fade, they just wait for someone to remember T. Hem.